listening to Chai Across Generations, a podcast to understand and maybe even bridge the gap between generations of South Asians. This is episode 6, which kicks off a series of discussions around mental health, which I feel is under-discussed in the community. This is Nikhil.
And this is Shankar. I must admit, Nikhil, that I felt a lot of emotions as we put this episode together. It triggered a lot of personal reflection for me and about those close to me. And it reminded me of music that helped me through hard times. It brought back songs I listened to years ago and hadn't heard in a long time. And in this episode, Nikhil and I first tried to define mental health, each in our individual perspective. And through that, we introduce a new lens by which to think about mental health and really examine if it's an opportunity, a pathology, or both.
Yes, honestly, Shankar, you can hear how much this topic means to you as you listen to this discussion. You brought such a nuanced and original way of thinking about mental health that I just wanted to hear more about it, and I just kept asking you questions. Mental health is a big topic, and this is part 1 of a multi-part series, the rest of which you'll hear in the coming weeks.
So let's dive into the discussion, and we'll come back at the end to wrap this one up.
Today we're talking about mental health, which is a big topic. I think we'll focus primarily on mental health, some of the costs, and some of the causes as well. So, Shankar, maybe I'll throw this to you. What is mental health?
I'm glad you brought that up, Nikhil, because one thing I learned from our Valentine's Day episode was that it's important to get on the same page about definitions. Remember how we had that long discussion and then we ended up actually asking the question, what do we mean by dating at the end of it?
Right, yeah.
So I thought that was interesting and in a way humorous, but also it informed me that it might be a good idea to get a baseline understanding on what we mean by that. So do you want to go first?
I'm happy to. That's a smart move of you to piggyback it back to me. So I was actually looking at the CDC's definition of mental health, and the CDC, Centers for Disease Control here in the US, defines mental health and says that it includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And they also say that mental and physical health are equally important components of overall health, which I think is really important. So I define it, I guess, similar to them as thinking about our emotional state, thinking about our psychological state. And a lot of it is the invisible stuff, right? It's, I think it has traditionally been more difficult to talk about mental health because we can't just see it, whereas a physical disability is easier to see to the eye. So it's more subtle. And I think it's one of the reasons we wanted to talk about it here, right? It's gotten a lot more attention over the last, call it 20, 30 years. I think my generation thinks about it quite a bit, and we grew up in an environment where we were lucky enough to be able to do that. So I'm excited to have this discussion, and yeah, I would anchor on the mental and the psychological piece of it.
Okay.
What would you say to that?
Interesting. So I'm really glad we started off with talking about this because I think I'm going to try and share with you a perspective that could be quite different, and you'll let me know. So the first thing when I think of the word mental is mental health. Mental is an adjective, right? And it says of the mind, right? Pertaining to the mind. So the first thing I say is, how do we define mind? What is mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. What is mind?
Okay, I'll take it. I do have a fairly, I think you will find a fairly clear explanation of what mind is. And this comes from a lot of the Indian spiritual tradition. So if you go back 5,000 years, in India, there was a very, very um, vigorous tradition of meditation. And when a lot of the world was looking outward, our spiritual leaders were looking inward, right? And they came up with two very important things. One is the anatomy of mind, and the other is the physiology of mind. And of course, needless to say, we know that mind is not the same as the brain. So while a lot of modern medicine has focused on the brain, 5,000 years ago, Indian seers, we call them rishis, were already masters of the mind. And that's something that I found very, very valuable as I was growing up. So, I grew up in a similar English educated, Western liberal education. I was getting that at school. But for some reason, I was very interested in this kind of stuff. And all my life, I've been reading Altered States of Consciousness by Charles Start, a Vedantic theory of personality. This has just been something that's always interested me. And so the broad definition that we have from and it might help, because having that perspective might help you guys understand how the older generation may think. No, I'm not saying everyone thinks this way, but I think it's a very, very useful framework to also connect what is ancient with what is modern. And I think there's value in both. So the anatomy that I'm talking about, we think of mind from the yoga. This comes from the Yoga Sutra, and where the fluctuations of the mind are first described. So there are 5 fluctuations, but the anatomy is more important. That there are basically 4 parts of the mind, and we call something manas. You might have heard that even in Tamil and other things, but in this tradition, it has a very specific meaning. It's the importer and exporter of sensations. So you're looking at me, or you're listening to me. There's a part of your mind, and we anatomically think of it as a part of the mind, which imports sensations and also exports them in the sense of motor skills and stuff like that. And there is another part of the mind which we think of as the storehouse of memories. You might think of it as a tape. So if you're not looking outward or engaging with your senses, then that sort of starts to play. You remember, if you close your eyes and sit in meditation, all the thoughts come up. So that is your storehouse of memories. We call that chitta. And then there is the sense of I-ness, which we call ahankar. And loosely you may say, although maybe that was what was meant, it's not entirely clear, but ego in the Freudian sense somewhat may correspond to ahankar. And then the final part is this thing called buddhi, which is our ability to see ourselves. So the very capacity of self-reflection, which the other animals, as far as we know, don't have. Our ability to see ourselves in the third person in an objective sense, I'm doing something, and that has different modes, but it's also the part of our mind that makes decisions. Now, why I bring up this whole anatomy thing is, and I've also explained the physiology because I've told you what each part does, right? Its function. This informs to me a framework within which we can talk about, I feel, mental health. And what you might find a little interesting is that I feel that the modern concept of mental health mostly focuses on pathology. So when we look at the DSM-4 or DSM-5, it only talks about what goes wrong. And that's a problem with modern medical science as a whole. It's always about disease, right? Which is a lack of ease. But historically, there's been a lot of work thinking about how do you support something positively? How do you develop the mind? How do you expand the mind, right? And so when we talk about the fact that mental health was not discussed too much in, say, traditional South Asian communities of various generations, maybe it may help us to understand that there was such an emphasis on the development of the mind that its pathologies may have been less discussed. Now, you and I are both interested in coaching and we engage in that. And you know that there also, you look at somebody who's in the trauma side and you send them to a therapist, and you look at somebody who is in a growth mindset and you bring them more towards
Right.
coaching. So I just want to put that out there because the emphasis of our traditional methods has been spiritual development. Spiritual development is expanding the mind, growing the mind to a very expansive state, right? And thinking
Right.
of consciousness behind the mind. And at the same time, it's extremely important, like you say, that we be healthy. So I'm not trying to say that it's not. I'm just trying to give you a different lens through which we can frame this, and maybe there'll be a useful discussion. But so
Right.
when I think of mental health, I think we can also think of it as supporting ourselves to become even better in some way.
Right.
Right.
So what I'm hearing, just to make sure I'm getting this, because you gave a very good and nuanced answer there that I appreciate, is mental health is not just the prevention, let's say,
Right.
of disease, as you said. It is also the expansion of the mind. There's the plus one side of it, right? As we would say in coaching, not just the minus one side.
Right.
Trying to gain and improve in some ways the mental well-being, not just the stay away from the worsening of mental health. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I just wanted to bring that out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think then that we do a disservice in how we speak about mental health today, or how we, maybe the popular perception of it, or do you think it captures both sides of the coin?
I do think in modern times there is a sense when we talk about mental health that it's negative, right? Right? And I thought of an analogy here that might explain, if you'll permit me to go a little
Of course,
longer into
yes.
this. Yeah. So we know that there's a spectrum, right? When we talk about mental health, we always think of the spectrum. And this suddenly struck me. I have an analog clock. You remember the old clocks where you actually have numerals? It's like 12 on top and then
Right.
1, 2, 3, going all the way around clockwise. And the way I think of it is that let's take the first quadrant, 12 to 3, right? And I think of that quadrant, you may say, is pathological mental disease, in the sense that this person is unable to conduct the activities of daily living. They may be a threat to their own physical well-being, to the physical well-being of others. And without supervision, this person is not capable of functioning, taking care of their body itself. Right? So think of it from 12:01 to 3, right? Okay. And I feel this is a very, that person's reality has become very, very individualized, so that it doesn't intersect much with the reality of people around them, right? Beyond 3, I think you get into what I call the functional, but could still have personality disorders. There can be very highly functional people who have very different kinds of personality disorders, right? So I think of 3 to 6, right, going down. You come to 6 to 9, I think of, again, functional people. They are able to share the reality of those around them, and they're probably very successful, and they're kind of trying to, but that's not the end. You're trying to grow. You're trying to maybe expand your spirituality, or what's the purpose of life, ask the big questions, expand your circle of concern to the whole world, right? And I think from 9 to 12, you sort of get into the realm of, philosophers, saints, holy men, people whose consciousness is expanded to a superconscious state. And so then you come all the way up to 12. Now, the interesting thing is 11:59 to 12:01 are very close.
Yeah.
Right? The way
Right.
that a spiritually realized person behaves is barely a sliver away from the way a madman behaves.
That's interesting.
Right?
Did you come up with this clock analogy, or?
Yeah, just-
Wow. You better copyright it or trademark it, Shankar, before someone else takes it. It's beautiful. Do you think Do you think the gap is actually very small between 11:59 and 12:01?
Yes, I think it is peculiarly, but it's very different in the sense in one case, that person's consciousness has expanded to encompass everything. It's huge.
Mm-hmm.
And in the other case, it's like a point. It's like a singularity. You know,
Hmm.
you did engineering, Didn't you at some point?
I did some computer science, if that
Oh,
counts.
right. So we have this thing of a delta function, right? Like a
Right.
point where it, and so I think that on one hand, it's like the point, and the other person is like looking
Mm-hmm.
out at infinity. And I actually have an anecdote to share with you. So my dad
Yeah.
used to tell me about this person. So there was a person called Sheshadri Swamigal in
Mm.
Arunachala, which is in South India, Tamil Nadu. And Sheshadri Swamigal was a realized soul, was the feeling. He's a person who had attained infinite. But his day to day behavior was completely random.
Hmm.
He would come out onto the street and he would laugh and say, oh, there's somebody going there. And he would go and push somebody's, there would be various peddlers, vendors selling fruits and vegetables and all kinds of stuff. You know how it is in India, if you particularly in the rural areas. And he would just go and knock a peddler's cart.
Hmm.
And that person would not be angry with him because the general feeling was that that day that person would have an amazing sales. It would just like break all records. Right. Now, I don't know about the um, veracity of that legend, if you may question that. But within society, people were accorded that sort of liberty of this kind of seemingly extreme antisocial behavior, uh, which, on the other hand, obviously he did some other things and said some other truths that maybe made people feel much better and realized or educated them, enlightened them, which may not have been there if somebody was just, unfortunately on that other spectrum at 1201. But I definitely remember these kind of instances. Even Sri Ramakrishna, who is, so well known all over the world, right? And there's so many missions in his name.
Yeah.
His behavior was, if you were to analyze it by DSM-4, they may say that this guy is pathologically insane.
Hmm.
But that was not the
Yeah.
case. But that was not the case, right?
Right. So let me ask you this: like, what I'm thinking about, if I look at myself, there are moments today, right? There are moments where I have some anxiety. Let's say about something at work,
Right.
something comes up, and I will do something like meditate, right? Or take a moment away, step outside to get some fresh air, come back. What I wonder is, as I try to move away from anxiety or to control my anxiety, I actually end up running toward calmness, right? Or a sense of feeling at peace.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, where does that fall on your clock from from 12 to, yeah, go ahead, from 1 to 12.
I love it because that's exactly the point I was thinking. Right? So I think we are not stuck at one point on the clock, is what I
Right.
believe. I believe that through the day we swing everywhere.
Mm,
But probably you're not swinging into the 12 to 3 yet because you're able to control it and bring yourself back into the functional space, is my
Yeah.
feeling. I completely agree with you. To me, this opened up my heart to have a lot of sympathy and compassion for people who are mentally ill. It can be very trying, and I know that from personal experience, to be caring for someone who is mentally ill or who's has a personality disorder or something like that. But when we actually sit and calm ourselves down, it's just compassion because sometimes I'm maybe having an oscillation on that side of the clock at some point.
right. Yeah, yeah. Would you define mental illness as a certain segment of the clock? Or do you think it extends to multiple parts of the clock?
So that's a powerful question, and it depends on who you talk to. This is again,
Right.
so in our spiritual tradition, there's actually a belief that to be anywhere other than 11:59 or 12 o'clock is illness. So to be sunk in the world is called bhavarogam. Rogam is illness. So all the super functional people who are charging around and being highly successful at work are mentally ill according to a spiritual from a spiritual perspective.
Hmm.
And that really turns stuff on its head, right?
Right.
And I think it's powerful because we think, oh, this person is so normal. And that
Right.
always brings to my mind this beautiful quote from Lewis Carroll, where, one of the characters runs around and says, I'm mad, you're mad, we're all mad. And that's what
Yeah.
he's trying to say. We're all just in
Yeah.
different degrees of madness. So that can open our hearts to stop stigmatizing this, for God's sake.
Right. Yes. I'm very glad you said that. And I just want to say that I think this is a case where your lived experience allows you to have a deeper kind of perspective on this than me. I mean, you're also just a very thoughtful person, but I really appreciate that. And it maybe highlights a little bit of that difference or divide in some ways between generations, where I think my generation feels certain things very acutely in this space, right?
Right.
And we are empowered to speak up about it in a
Yes.
way that maybe your generation didn't have the opportunity to. And we are standing on the shoulders of what your generation has done, right? So we can think about these factors a little bit more.
So that concludes our first part of this discussion on mental health, where, Nikhil, you brought us to a nice summary of how each of us and maybe others in our generation perceive mental health. And I really liked the continuity of thought that you expressed in your final comments. We will dig deeper into stigma and other topics in our next episode, won't we, Nikhil?
Yes, we will. This is part one of a multi-part series, and you all will hear the other parts coming up. I have to say, Shankar, that I really loved your clock analogy. It totally caught me by surprise, and I'm not sure if you can tell, but I was definitely processing that in real time on the episode. I now find myself wondering which part of the clock I'm in during my day.
Oh, that's cool. I'm really grateful that it resonated. By the way, in a new twist in this episode, we're not telling you which songs the intro, transition, and outro music that I played are taken from.
Instead, we're having a competition to see who can first identify the original three pieces of music on which Shankar has based his version. We'd love to hear from you on Instagram at Chai Across Generations or through email at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
Folks, we'll announce a list of winners in our next episode. In order to have a complete entry for our competition, we need you to correctly identify the piece, the intro, the transition, or the outro, with the name of the song and the band or musician who played it.
It would be great if you could share a sentence on what the song means to you in the context of our episode topic of mental health. If you could please share your age, where you're listening from, and optionally your name, we'll give you a shout out and read out what the song means to you in the context of the theme.
I'm really looking forward to seeing who gets it. Friends, did you know that it's been 30 days since we started our podcast? And we're really thrilled to see about 500 downloads today. So if you like what you've heard and aren't tired of us by now, please do subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Has it really been that long? Wow, thank you all so much for your support. It means a lot to us. We'll see you all next time.